Mardu Robinson, Elizabeth Welsh, Harry Worth, and at the piano, Russ Conley.
Marvelous, thank you all for coming along.
Bill Fraser, you did more than roll out the barrel. You actually served in Johnny's squadron for a spell as a signals officer.
That's right, I was his signals officer on the D-Day landings. And on behalf of all ground crew, may I say how proud we were to have under him.
Well, Johnny, I don't know if this distinguished visitor pictured over here with you in Normandy, wartime Premier Winston Churchill, was aware of these unofficial beer deliveries. Here at the tiny French village of Saint-Croix-sur-Mer, 15 miles north of Caen, and if you look at that screen, Johnny, the villagers recall the welcome arrival of you and your Spitfires only 5 days after the D-Day invasion and after 4 years of German occupation.
Comment pourrions-nous jamais vous oublier? Vous et vos Spitfires.
How could we ever forget you? You and your Spitfires landing here, right here. It was a field of vegetables before your men converted it to a makeshift runway for your planes. Your Spitfires were the very first to operate from French soil. Some great battles had taken place here. A delegation from our village came to welcome you after the long years of occupation. We didn't have much to offer you, but we managed to find some fruit, some flowers, some wine, and a little glass of Calvados.
Calvados.
Du vin et un petit verre de Calvados.
We realized there was one English airman who was a wonderful pilot, and from time to time he came to see us to say hello when he came back from combat duty and said he'd shot down some more Germans. But we know you'll never forget Saint-Croix-sur-Mer for one particular reason. The day you landed in our cabbage field after shooting down your 33rd enemy plane, you became the champion British fighter pilot of the war.
Nous portons ce toast à la santé de Johnny Johnson et des pilotes des Spitfires de Sainte-Croix-sur-Mer. À votre santé!
Thank you, everyone in Saint-Croix-sur-Mer. But Danny Brown, Johnny had only one real regret in Normandy, that he wasn't able to take on the Luftwaffe ace Walter Matthoni, who flew his own distinctive long-nosed Focke-Wulf when leading his Messerschmitts.
Yes, there was a fighter pilot that had gained quite some distinction with the Luftwaffe, and he was identified as a gentleman named Matthoni. And we were always, and especially Johnny, was very eager to get any word from the controller as to whether the long-nosed 190 with a yellow nose cowling was in the air. This was picked up by the newspapers, and this was developed into a situation allegedly that Johnny was challenging Matthoni to a duel a la the days of World War I.
Well, now, Larry Robilliard, it was a meeting with a squadron of Focke-Wulfs over the Seine that led Johnny to being hit for the first and only time in the war. Absolutely astonishing when you think how many sorties he'd had.
Yeah, it was pretty surprising to us because we'd seen him shot out a lot and he'd never been hit. And this was quite a day. There was 23 of our Spitfires led by Johnny we attacked a rather large formation of Germans, estimated to be about 80 plus. And in the ensuing dogfight, we lost 2 of our boys, but we did shoot down 12, and Johnny got 2. And then there was a panic of reorganizing and splitting up, and Johnny formed up in error with what he thought were American fighters, but turned out to be some Focke-Wulf 190s. So there was quite a bit of noise on the RT. And so we went looking for him, at his direction, mind you. And after some time, we were relieved to hear him ask for landing instructions back at base. And when we got back, he was busy examining this one bullet hole that went through his wing.
So what did he do next?
Oh, if I remember correctly, in no time flat, he was back up in the air sniffing away. You know, figuring, it's like falling off a horse. You got to get going again.
Well, a bit like falling off a horse, thereby hangs, if you forgive me, another tale of St. Croix. Being in the country between missions, you fancied the idea of some horse riding. On one flight, just a few miles from the enemy lines, you had noticed a couple of SS cavalry horses corralled in the grounds of a chateau there. You decide on a bit of horse rustling.
But Johnny, what we didn't know was that we were heading for the Normandy equivalent of the gunfight at the OK Corral.
He should know because he was there with you. Haven't seen each other since those days 40 years ago. From Ontario, Canada, Flight Lieutenant Johnny Irwin. Tell us what happened to this gunfight at the OK Corral.
Johnny was absolutely determined to have one of these horses. So we he put a saddle and bridle in the Jeep, and we headed for the lines, and eventually found the chateau and the horses. Just as we were about to get our hands on a horse, Jerry started lobbing some mortar shells at us, and so we had to duck for cover, and we dove into a stream, which is not too bright, but, we crawled under a bridge for cover, and eventually the shelling stopped, so we then got hold of the horse, and I got aboard it and headed back, and Johnny came up, brought up the rear to cover my tail. And when Johnny got back to base, everybody was very surprised to see a very wet wing commander.
Thank you, Johnny Irwin. From St. Croix, you press on to Belgium, then Holland. You're there at historic Arnhem, and at the airfield at Twente, you thought at last you'd had it. On the ground at that, you'd just landed, and a Messerschmitt came in to attack you. Can you recall your thoughts?
Not very pleasant, Eamon, I would think.
You thought you'd had it, I suppose, and how ironic if you'd had it on the ground, but 2 shells from a Bofors anti-aircraft gun hit the Messerschmitt before it could hit you, and you lived to fight again. Next, over the Baltic, Wismar Bay. Your base was at the German town of Celle. One night, you've returned to base, but 11 Spitfires of a Belgian squadron also returned, but the 12th is missing. Its pilot, their English commanding officer, is a good friend of yours. Only a month before, he'd been shot down, escaped captivity, and somehow got back to you. This time, his Belgian squadron had seen this fighter shot to pieces and burst into flames, and this time, you felt there could be no hope.
And Johnny, I think you were still raising your glasses to me, your dead comrade, when I walked into the bar, just 2 weeks later.
Incredibly, yes. Taken prisoner, badly burned. He escaped a second time. Squadron leader Terry Spencer. Oh, Johnny must have been knocked out to see you walking in.
Well, I'm not quite sure that was the case, you know, because Johnny was a fairly hard taskmaster in those days. And well, when I walked on the first time I got back into his caravan, after 5 weeks as a prisoner, he stood up, smiled, and said, "Where the bloody hell have you been these last 5 weeks?" So I thought, well, this time I'm going to make it back in 2 weeks.
Now, Terry, your Belgian squadron could hardly be blamed for reporting back to Johnny that you must certainly have perished in that action.
Well, I don't know, Eamon, I guess so. But what actually happened was we dived down on this oil tanker in the Bay at Wismar, doing something like 450 miles an hour, very fast in those days. And when I got about 30 feet off the sea, my Spitfire was blown in two. I was blown out, the chute was blown out of the pack, and a split second later I was standing in 4 feet of water. And that, by the way, got into the Guinness Book of Records and is still in as the lowest parachute jump on record. And anyway, you know, you had to do things for Johnny in those days, I tell you. And I was burnt and taken to a German military hospital, and a couple of weeks later, I mean, I was trying to work this deadline, I staggered out of through these very disorganized German lines at that stage back to our mess, and I staggered into the mess looking extremely bedraggled, and I thought, well, now I must impress Johnson this time, surely. And anyway, in true Johnson fashion, I'm loaded with champagne. I remember staggering out of the mess at midnight and passed out.
And woke up with a cardboard cutout and ribbon of the DFC hanging round your neck. A message next to it said, immediate DFC, and it was no joke, was it?
No. Well, you know, Johnny, I have to say, was one of those guys that always gave praise to other people. You're a great guy, Johnny, and God bless you.
Thank you, Terry Spencer. Johnny, after that titanic push across Europe, fighting your way through the sky from Normandy, Paris, Brussels, Arnhem, across the Rhine, into Germany over Berlin, with bitter fighting to the very finish, the war ended for you in Denmark, flushing out the last pockets of enemy resistance. There you are being congratulated by Field Marshal Montgomery. And it's to Copenhagen we go now to hear from a member of the Danish royal family, a former defense attaché who remembers you well, Prince George of Denmark.
Dear Minister, Johnny Johnson, my friend, you must have been slightly surprised of the reception you got when you and your co-pilots were hauled out of your aeroplanes and their cockpits, put in to cars and driven into Copenhagen, hugged and kissed by, what I may say myself, rather good-looking Danish girls. You've left so many friends in this country that the name Johnny Johnson will stand in the world as an extremely heroic gentleman.
Thank you, Prince George of Denmark at the Royal Palace. You end the war, Johnny, as group captain with 7 decorations for gallantry. You're posted to Canada, to Staff College, then to America, to Langley Fields, Virginia as exchange officer. But peacetime is short-lived for you, and in June 1950, you're posted back on active service as an air tactical observer to the United States Air Force in Korea.
That's right, Johnny, and very grateful we were for your hard-earned experience.
The last time you saw him was in Korea. American Air Force Colonel Bud Maharin. Colonel, you had flown with the RAF. In fact, you shot down 21 enemy fighters yourself, so you weren't strangers when you met in Korea, and you were very glad of his experience.
Yes, indeed, with the advent of jet aircraft, and of course complicated weapon systems, experience was really required, and I believe you yourself stated that most of the pilots over there were gray-haired, well-decorated, and very distinguished.
Oldest and the boldest.
Oldest? No, that was later. That was, I believe, your motto when you said, I'd rather be an old pilot than a bold pilot. Anyway, we were very glad to have you over there, and I bring with me the best wishes of all your friends in the United States. It's wonderful to see you again.
Thank you, Colonel Bud Maharin. Back in England, you're posted to RAF Cottesmore in Lincolnshire, this time to Bomber Command. It's 1957, and the strategically important V Bomber Force was being formed.
And Johnny, nothing, but nothing, would deflect you from your duty except fishing.
Your Air Officer Commanding Air Chief Marshal Sir Kenneth Cross, known to you since your wartime days as Bing Cross.
U.S. at Gone, he said.
Sir Kenneth, you were his boss. Sounds like quite a character to handle.